Everybody. Good morning. Good morning. I'm Paul Grogan, the president of the Boston Foundation. Pleased to welcome you here this morning. You may notice that I have a little different appearance this morning, and I really appreciate the well wishes of many of you as I recover from an injury I suffered in an accident. Although I didn't quite appreciate when one person on my staff said, "Hey, Paul, you really don't need your name tag. You're the one who looks like hell. Everybody will know who you are." But anyway, we're very excited to be here. Before I make my brief remarks and introduce Barry, I want to recognize two of our fine elected officials who are here today. Senator Ken Donnelly from Arlington. Senator, where are you? Thanks for being here. And our good friend, City Councilor Rob Consalvo is here. Rob, can you stand up? And I particularly want to congratulate Rob on the spirited campaign that he ran for mayor. I think he distinguished himself, and he's going to be leaving the City Council in January after 10 years of distinguished service, and I think a lot of us are very interested in what he'll do next. So, Rob, thank you for joining us this morning. Many of you are very familiar with the Boston Foundation, but if there are some who are not, we are, of course, Greater Boston's Community Foundation, established in 1915, one of the oldest community foundations in the country, and we serve as a major funder of nonprofit organizations throughout the city and the region, and we work as a philanthropic partner with philanthropists across the region as well. And pleased to announce that in our fiscal year, which concluded on June 30th, the Boston Foundation set an all-time record by distributing over $98 million in grants, mostly to Boston area nonprofits. But as today signifies, the foundation also likes to play a role in trying to shed light on the particular trends, challenges, and issues that we face here in Greater Boston. And so you're familiar with the Understanding Boston Forums, which has really become, I think, one of the most important things we do at the foundation. And this program of forums is made possible in part through donations to our Civic Leadership Fund and to the Permanent Fund for Boston. To the donors in the audience, thank you very, very much. This is a wonderful time to renew for the 11th time our engagement with Professor Bluestone around the issue of housing in our community. There is so much going on. We'll hear about a recovery that's underway in housing, but it has its downsides, as it always seems to. We've got a mayor's race underway, as I mentioned, and issues of housing, of planning, of zoning, of the very shape of the city, the size of the city are being talked about in a more open and fuller way than they have been in many years. And so it's a good time for this report to be able to flow into that expansive discussion. Last year, one day before the release of the 2012 Housing Report Card, Governor Patrick announced an ambitious goal to produce 10,000 multifamily units of housing per year in the Commonwealth. And as we know, just last month, Mayor Menino announced his own plan to build 30,000 units of housing in the city of Boston by the year 2020. And earlier this year, a group of advocates and legislators came together at the State House to push for zoning reforms that will modernize outmoded subdivision and planning laws in Massachusetts. This increased attention to housing is a necessary component of our future economic growth and is a very welcome development. I do want to remind you that the foundation in its grant making has been a major funder of the housing and community development sector for decades. In addition, the foundation has played an important research, convening, and advocacy role. We were very involved in the formation in 2002 of the Commonwealth Housing Task Force, which played a major role in the passage of smart growth housing legislation, chapters 40R and 40S, and we're going to be hearing something about the status of that legislation today. Currently, our grant-making strategy focuses on supporting the production and preservation of housing in smart growth neighborhoods with a focus on low and extremely low-income families and individuals, increasing the capacity and effectiveness of Boston's community development system, as well as continued support for housing advocacy and the advancement of statewide policies promoting mixed use and mixed income housing. Over the last 4 years, our grant investments primarily supporting the housing and community development field total over $6 million, with significant funding supporting nonprofit housing production focused on vulnerable populations and CDC-led joint ventures for mixed-use developments near transit nodes like the Fairmont Indigo Line, now getting so much deserved attention. But aligning the need for housing with public policy and funding choices is a complex task, and we are extremely fortunate, once again, to have Barry Bluestone here to report and interpret on the state of our housing, what it means to our economy, and to present the policy choices facing the city and the Commonwealth that will shape our future. As we are going to do in a kind of a typical format, Barry will present the findings of the report. We're going to hear from Aaron Gornstein from the governor's viewpoint, and then Mary Jo Meisner will moderate our typically expert and terrific panel to probe more deeply into the findings. Most of you know Barry very well. He's the founding director of the Kitty and Michael Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Planning. He is the dean of the School of Public Policy, and as I like to say, a leading example of what the intellectual firepower in this community can mean when it is turned onto local and regional issues that we really need to understand. So it is a great pleasure to welcome back to this microphone our good friend Barry Bluestone.
Thanks, buddy. Thank you, Paul. Well, it's wonderful to be here again for the 11th year. As I said, I started doing this when I was a wee lad a number of years ago. But Paul, the intellectual firepower for reports like this has a lot to do with a lot of people, not just me. We had a wonderful team of people at the Dukakis Center, at Housing Partners, Inc., working with the state, who helped us put together what is, in many ways, as you'll see, the most complex housing report card we've done. I'm going to move through a lot of slides very quickly so we can hear from Aaron and we can hear from our panel. And we're going to start by taking a look at the questions we decided we wanted to ask in this report card. The first was, well, what has happened to home sales and housing production and foreclosures during the past 2 years? And what has happened to home prices and rents? And what roles have the federal government, the state, and now the city played in meeting our housing needs? But we also wanted to pose 3 questions about the future. The first was, given economic conditions, are we on the verge of another housing bubble? Prices rising? Are they going to continue to rise and give us something that looked like last decade when we saw home prices doubling in a very short period of time and rising by double-digit rates each year? Will that happen again? Second of all, given the changing demographics, aging baby boomers like myself and young millennials, have we begun to build an appropriate new housing stock for the new demographics of Greater Boston? And what kinds of changes in zoning regulations at the local level seem to encourage the production of multifamily housing, as the governor and Mayor Menino have suggested we need? We've done a complete new econometric statistical analysis of zoning. We have some very interesting results from that. But first, let's start with the economic context. This is what has happened in the national economy in terms of the economy going back to 1994 through the middle of this year. And you'll see that Great Recession that we had beginning in 2008 and then this slow recovery. And we asked, well, what was really the forces driving that Great Recession? And you'll see right here that residential fixed investment was the key to that decline. The housing collapse actually led us into the worst recession since the Great Depression. We then have seen a slow, modest recovery, never growing as fast as 3%, which is what we really need to get our unemployment rate down. And if we ask, well, what caused that recovery? First of all, you see it was much slower. We've only averaged about a 2.2% growth rate after this recession, much slower than the growth we've had after previous recessions going back to the mid-'70s. But if you ask, well, what kind of led that recovery, slow as it might be, it was non-residential fixed investment, commercial, industrial, but it was also residential fixed investment. Again, housing playing a critical role in the overall economy. So you can almost think about it as working in both ways. The economy affects the housing market, but the housing market is critical for the overall economy. Of course, that slow recovery has left us with very high unemployment nationwide, but it is also, and unfortunately, and what will affect housing in the future, left us with stagnant income. Income this year is no higher than it was in 2008 at the beginning of the Great Recession, and that's a problem we have to worry about beyond housing. If we look at the housing market itself, we see a significant recovery. The number of sales has risen rapidly since it's bottomed out in 2010. And in fact, this year we project for the entire year we will have more sales than we had at any time since about 1997 or so. And it will be higher than the average going back to the early 1980s. That's a good sign. Housing's coming back after a long dearth. And with housing sales coming back, construction has started to come back. We're not at the 2 million units a year that we once were, but we've seen a 60% increase in new permits since the 2009-2011 period. Again, solid recovery. And what has driven that has been very low mortgage rates, historically low mortgage rates. And while they have come up very sharply in the last 6 months, they're still below the kind of long-term average. Switching to the Massachusetts economy, we have been doing better than the rest of the country. And we expect in the third and fourth quarters of this year to continue to outperform the national economy. Those bars are Massachusetts. That blue line is GDP growth per year in the nation. But as we've seen in the recent data, we've had this tremendous solid growth in bringing employment back. We've recovered all the jobs we've lost in the Great Recession. But beginning in the spring of this year, we saw a stall in the economy. No new jobs being created net new jobs being created over the last few months. And that has meant that while the unemployment rate came down and is still somewhat below the national, it has picked up very quickly to 7.2, now 7.3% in the state. You can see the gap in the unemployment rate between the federal level, the national level in Massachusetts. At one point, our unemployment rate was a full 1.6 percentage points lower than the nation. It has shrunk to just about 0.2 of 1 point. So the rest of the nation is catching up with us, but that's because our economy is slowing down a little faster than the rest of the country in terms of job creation. Let's now go from the nation to Massachusetts down to Greater Boston. And by Greater Boston, we generally are looking at the 5 counties in eastern Massachusetts: Essex, Middlesex, Norfolk, Plymouth, and Suffolk counties. About 161 communities out of the 351 communities in Massachusetts. We've had, since 2000, a growth of about 140,000 residents. We're growing again in our community, and that means 55,000 more households. And the other thing that's important in terms of this great demographic revolution is the aging of the population. That huge baby boom generation, 78 million of us who were born after World War II through 1964, are now getting into our senior years, as we like to say. The median age has risen from 33.4 years to 38.4 years between 1990 and today. That demographic shift is going to be very important for what is a mammoth shift in the need for housing. The sad part, of course, is that as the economy has slowed down over that Great Recession and is coming back only slowly, median household income has hardly risen at all. For homeowners, since 2000, between 2000 and 2011, controlling for inflation, median household income has risen by a grand total of 0.9%. Not per year, over that whole period, when we used to grow at something between 3 and 4% a year. And renter income has fallen by 13%. And what that's going to mean is even if home prices and rents were to be stable, affordability would have declined. So we take a look at costs. The Economic Policy Institute, Truth in Advertising, I was one of the founding board members of the Economic Policy Institute in Washington, has kept track of what the living costs are for a working family, not a poor family, but a working family, going back to 2005. And they just published a new report, and they say to really meet the needs of a working family of four, two parents, two school-age kids, you need about $85,000 here. That makes us the third highest cost of living metro, large metro in the country. And by the way, that's a significant increase over their 2005 estimates. The result is that today, between 2005 and 2011, a family budget of four in Greater Boston, taking account not just housing, but health care costs and transportation and so forth, has grown by about 33% in nominal terms. Renter household income, in nominal terms, not controlling for inflation, just went up by 9.6%, right? So costs of living going up 3 times faster than renter incomes. And going up faster, costs of a family budget going up a third faster than even homeowners. The other thing that's happening, as we all know in this room, I think, is just continued growing inequality. One way of looking at that is look at our 5 counties and look at where they were in terms of their income back in 2005 and what the percentage growth in their income was since then. And Norfolk leads the pack. It was the richest, and it's had the fastest growth in income since then. And Suffolk was the poorest and has the slowest growth. Or another way to look at it is, where are we growing? Here we look at families that are low income, under 80% of the area median household income, the moderate 80 to 100, middle up to 120, and then the high 120% or more of median. And you'll see we've had a large growth in our low income population, a significant growth in our wealthy population, thank you, a drop in the middle, the missing middle that, as a matter of fact, I wrote about in a book in 1988. As a result, and this is critical, we have seen a significant decline in affordability. For renters paying 30% or more of their rent, of their gross income in rent, in 2000, 39%, bad record back then. It's now over half are spending more than 30% of their income, and more than a quarter are spending more than half of their gross income on rent. And even for home owners who tend to be a bit wealthier, that number has gone from 26.7% paying more than 30% of their gross income in housing costs to 40%, 2 in 5. So affordability has really become, again, the critical issue. Okay? Let's look at Greater Boston's housing recovery. What we've seen is home sales finally rebounding, slowly, not great. There's been very little product on the market, as many homeowners have been holding off even if they want to sell to see if home prices will come up. But there's been a huge increase, thanks be God, in housing permits. There's new construction coming online, 114% increase since 2011 in the number of housing permits that we expect will be permitted, will be issued throughout 2013 by the end of this year. That's our best guess. The real exciting thing is that developers are so far ahead of us eggheads. They're recognizing the demographic shift. 2000 to 2002, 2/3 of all the permits were for single-family homes. A decade later, it's up to 62% multifamily and only 1/3 single-family, reflecting the change in demographics of an aging baby boom generation, many who will be seeking smaller housing options, and young people who are not ready to buy the 4-bedroom home in the outer suburbs. The other thing that's been really exciting to us, particularly to Ted Carman and Eleanor White and myself, who helped create Chapter 40R, is that 40R didn't seem to be doing much after it was legislated in 2005. Now we have over 1,500 units that have already been completed, and another large number that will be up because they've already been permitted. We expect to see about 2,400 units completed within the next 6 months. That's a real record of achievement for this legislation, and you're going to hear more about it when Ted speaks later today. The thing that I'm most excited about has been the reduction in foreclosure deeds. These are completed foreclosures, are down 75% since 2010. Real progress there. And even more importantly in some ways is the number of foreclosure petitions. That's the first step in foreclosure, down 88%, which means what we expect many, many fewer foreclosures in the coming year. That means that's very, very important, of course, for some of our older communities and inner city communities where the foreclosures have been concentrated. Well, let's take a look at what's happened to home prices and rents. Our vacancy rate has come down from over 2% in the homeowner market. It's still at 1.2, 1.4, which is well above the 0.3 and 0.6 we had during the time when housing prices were exploding. So those vacancy rates reduce some of the pressure that we otherwise might have in the housing market. And as a result, according to the Case-Shiller index, prices have been rising across the country. They've risen modestly here, and if you see from our friend Tim Warren and Warren data, you'll see that we've kind of stabilized prices. Some prices are going very quickly, like in Boston, but in other communities they haven't risen very much at all. So over all of Greater Boston, home prices have been relatively stable, rising slowly. We've kept track each year of the old housing cycle, the one that began in 1988 and didn't end until 1997, from the time that home prices fell and then recovered to their previous peak. And each year we've tried to see if we could predict when home prices, which began falling in 2005 in the fall, would get back to where they were nominally. And this is what the chart looks like. And if we continue that rise, you see that there were years in which it was going up and down. We didn't know what direction it was going. It looks like home prices might, if they continue, get back to where they were, not any higher than they were back in 2005, sometime in 2015 or early 2016. But this one, I don't have a great deal of certainty about it. The fact is that across the country, our housing prices for single-family homes have been rising much slower than other cities where housing prices had plummeted as much as 62% in places like Las Vegas or 43% in Miami. Ours had only fallen by about 18 or 19%. They've come back about 10.7% from their bottom, much slower than Phoenix or Atlanta or some other cities. If we look at prices of condominiums, they have also stabilized. And one of the things, again, reflecting the demographics, has been a shrinking gap between the prices of single-family homes and condos. Way back in the beginning of the last decade, in 2000, the typical condo, the median price of a condo was 68% of the median price of a single-family home. It's been in the 80% range for the last number of years as there's been greater demand for condos and smaller units. Where we have seen a very dramatic increase is in 2 and 3 unit housing, the typical triple-decker. Those prices plummeted when they were artificially inflated during the housing boom. Many small investors buying up some of these 2 and 3 unit apartments and renting them out. Those prices plummeted then during the housing bubble crash. Now they've been coming back rather sharply. That's a small part of the total stock, but that's one place where we see it. And again, the demand for smaller units and apartment and condos rising quickly. In terms of our rental market, that has been quite different. Rental vacancy rates have plummeted since they peaked at 6.4% in 2009. They're now at 3.8, 3.7%, which is well below the 5.5% that we estimate is needed to stabilize rents. As a result, you'll see here that asking rents have just continued to rise regardless of what's going on in the economy. Great recession comes along, unemployment soars, rents still went up. And even if you take into account discounts, we'll give you a month free, those effective rents have continued to rise dramatically. And that's a real problem, particularly when you look at the much lower and falling incomes of renter households. In fact, we have the 3rd highest effective rents among the top 20 metro areas in the country. One of the things we did this year, and I'm very proud of our team who worked on this, is to really take a close look at zoning. We've been saying for years, since our first report in 2002 for the Cardinal and the Chamber of Commerce, that zoning was the real restriction here, particularly in our outer suburbs. And so we took a look at that, and what we found was that the average, we wanted to look at multifamily housing units, that across the 159 communities, we didn't have Boston data on this, but almost everybody else in the greater Boston 5-county area, on average, multifamily housing production was about 2.03% of the existing total stock of housing, single family and multifamily. across those 159 communities. There were 20 communities that had a 4.91% or better, almost 5% increase in multifamily. There were another 27 municipalities that did better than the average for the whole region. But there were 79 communities that did much worse, and there were 33 municipalities that over the period 2005 to 2012 did not produce a single unit of multifamily housing. This is what the map looks like. The darker the color, the more likely they were producing multifamily housing. You'll see it spread out to the northwest and to some of the southern suburbs toward the southeast. Well, we did a wonderful analysis with our graduate students in which we got a hold of data from the Pioneer Institute, which had gathered data on all of the zoning regs, and there are dozens and dozens and dozens of them, in every community in Massachusetts. And we took those data, and we created 37 different zoning variables. And then we asked the question, which of these variables were correlated with an increase in multifamily production? And there were 3 zoning regulations that seem to have the greatest impact in encouraging the development of the kind of housing we need. One was 40R. 40R districts are the potential for 56% more multifamily housing than the average in the region. Inclusionary zoning, where developers are given the right to exceed the zoned number of units on a parcel in return for producing some affordable units, have seen a 74% increase in their production of multifamily housing relative to the average. And cluster development, like the new Riverside project in Newton, where you have a large piece of land and you allow a large development, but you have green space around it, we've seen 3 times more multifamily housing going. So we know there are certain kinds of zoning regulation that if we could get other communities to adopt, we could begin to have even greater success in meeting the governor's target and the mayor's target for multifamily housing, right? That's what we know. Finally, I want to close on talking a little bit about public policy. I think one of the great things is that in the last year, we've seen a renewed emphasis on housing and the importance of housing and economic development and meeting our people's needs. At the city level, with the mayor's blueprint, that you'll hear more about in a little while from the panel, in the governor's call for the 10,000 units that Paul mentioned in his conference almost a year ago, and even from President Obama, who came out with a major speech on the need for affordable housing. So we have Mayor Menino, his goal of 30,000 units of new housing, looking for public and private investment of $16.5 billion by the end of this decade to encourage that, housing for 10,000 full-time students, undergraduate and graduate students, something we've been pushing hard in the Greater Boston Housing Report Cards in the past, more flexibility in the city's regulations and housing, unit size, and parking, and new plan calls for greater flexibility to produce the kind of housing we need for the new demographic. And then the Commonwealth, Governor Patrick, goal, 10,000 units a year through 2020. New compact neighborhoods program to supplement 40R. New housing development incentive program in our older industrial cities to encourage market rate housing, to bring back the middle class to those communities. New residential assistance for families in transition for dealing with the homeless. Chapter T to try and deal, 40T, to deal with the question of expiring use and the loss of existing affordable units. And $1.4 billion in capital spending over the next 5 years for various housing projects. And then President Obama has weighed in. Support for legislation to refinance new homes at lower interest rates, a promise to issue an executive order when the government comes back into business to expand the pool of borrowers eligible for loans from federally backed programs, continued support for the 30-year mortgage, the introduction of possibly getting rid of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, but some substitute for that, an assessment of a fee on mortgages in order to deal with producing affordable housing for low and moderate income families. We also took a look at public funding for housing, and of course with ARRA, American Recovery Act, we had a big boost in funding here in the state, as you can see in 2010, 2011, 2012, as part of the federal stimulus. And this really helped us in the housing here. But those monies are gone. Federal money is not coming in at the same level. And that has meant that the total amount of money that the Department of Community and Housing Development here in the state has, including the federal share, peaked in 2011, and we expect in fiscal 2014 it will be about the same level as last year, but below what we've had in the last years during the stimulus. So what are the major conclusions at the end of this? Is there going to be another housing bubble? I keep being asked that question. I was just asked that question on WBUR this morning. I think not, and I'll tell you why. One is that single-family home prices may continue to increase. They may get back to where they were in 2005, but it's not going to be a sharp increase, and certainly 3, 4, 5, 6 years from now, we're going to see lower pressures. One is the demographic shift that we've been talking about. Empty nesters, younger generations' demand for single-family homes are constrained by depressed income and high debt. Younger generations' desire for the old-fashioned single-family home that many of us grew up in if you were a baby boomer. That is not what our sons and daughters want to do. And that's certainly true of my 22-year-old son who I've talked with about this. Rising mortgage rates, almost inevitable, whatever happens to the government default or not, will slow down the demand for single-family homes. Tighter mortgage regulations have already done that. And we do have an increased new supply of housing, which will moderate those home prices in the future. So I'm not as worried about another bubble. What I am worried about is housing affordability. The combination of renewed increases in home and condo prices and continued increases in rents increases the cost of housing in Greater Boston. But much more important is the stagnating income for homeowners and the absolute declining income for renters. This is what's really hitting the housing market. And the increased income inequality exacerbates all of this. So we got $2.3 million median home prices in Boston. We've seen home prices stagnate or fall in other communities because people just can't afford them anymore. Housing production, with rising home sales, with increasing population, low mortgage rates, still low by historic standards, developers are moving into high gear. And they're producing multi-unit housing at near record levels. So what's the future? Well, one, if zoning reform and regulatory relief on such matters as parking and unit size allow more multifamily housing construction, if developers continue to take advantage of state policies to build more housing, if we find a way to house more of our graduate students and young professionals in new housing, freeing up the older but sturdy stock for working families, and if we continue to implement public policies aimed at meeting Governor Patrick's and Mayor Menino's goals for housing production, then we finally have a shot at moderating income prices and rent increases so that more Greater Boston households can find affordable housing in the region's 161 cities and towns. But this will take vigilance. If we all do this, we'll finally be fulfilling the moral obligation that we wrote about in our 2000 report, The Cardinal and the Chamber, to house all our people in decent, affordable housing, and finally fulfill the economic necessity of providing affordable housing that can help maintain our economic prosperity. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barry. Barry has got to be one of the best presenters of the most comprehensive amount of data. And as his editor for 10 years, I have to say he's also one of the easiest edits there is. So, and I was a pretty good editor, so. Thank you very much, Barry. My name is Mary Jo Meissner. I'm Vice President for Communications and Public Affairs here at the Boston Foundation. It's my pleasure to serve as your moderator today. But the first order of business I have is that I have the delightful responsibility of introducing our next guest before we get to our panelists, and that is Aaron Gornstein, to offer some brief remarks on behalf of the Patrick administration. Aaron really probably needs no introduction in this audience. We all know him very, very well, but I'm going to do it anyway. Aaron Gornstein is the Undersecretary for Housing and Community Development for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Aaron oversees the Department of Housing, Community Development, and he serves as the Chief Housing Policy Advisor to the Secretary of Housing and Economic Development, Greg Belsky, and to Governor Deval Patrick. He also serves as the chairman of the Community Economic Development Assistance Corp., which provides technical and financial assistance to nonprofit developers of affordable housing. Prior to his appointment, where I think most of us really know Aaron from, is his service as the executive director of CHAPA, the Citizens Housing and Planning Association, from 1990 to January of 2010. Aaron is one of the most credible and admired and distinguished members of the housing community, particularly in terms of housing, affordable housing in the greater Boston region. He received his undergraduate degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and his graduate degree from Tufts University Department of Urban and Environmental Policy. So it's my pleasure to introduce our good friend, Aaron Gornstein.
Thank you, Mary Jo. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks for your leadership and Paul's leadership on community development issues here at the Foundation. It's been a privilege to work with you for so many years. And to Barry, it's true, he's the best presenter I've seen, and a great writer, and it's so cogent, and he's able to capture all the major trends in a very short presentation. So it's tough to follow Barry, but I also want to acknowledge Representative Sanchez for his leadership on the Hill on affordable housing in the legislature, so thank you. And I just wanted to update you. Yep, he deserves... I wanted to update you on some of our new initiatives at DHCD, and Barry's mentioned a few of them, but before I do that, I wanted to convey the dire consequences of the federal government shutdown if it continues much longer. Thousands of state employees will be facing furloughs or layoffs, and dozens of programs for low-income families, seniors, and veterans will soon run out of funding. At our agency alone, as of November 1st, we will not be able to provide heating assistance to 200,000 households, and we will not be able to make rent payments for 20,000 low-income households receiving Section 8 assistance, and 35 home projects with 1,500 units of affordable housing will be delayed. So we need the CR to pass as quickly as possible. There have been impacts already being felt, but November 1st is really, I think, the turning point for people who are actually going to be denied benefits as the winter season is upon us. And it was cold last night in my house, and if you're a senior citizen relying on fuel assistance, it's going to be tough come November 1st if you're not able to get heat. Those are just some of the consequences, and there are many others. But let me set that aside and talk about more positive things, which is the multifamily housing production initiatives, as well as what we're doing on public housing reforms. And I'll finish up on a few other things. So we're pursuing a number of initiatives regarding the governor's goal of producing 10,000 multifamily units annually. And I'm pleased to report that through August of this year, the state has produced 5,500 multifamily units statewide, which is 65% higher than at that time last year. So far, we are on pace to have the best year on multifamily housing since 2006. And so what are we doing to try and accelerate that? Not all of it is due to our actions. Of course, there's the private market that's responding to pent-up demand, and but what we are trying to really push projects forward. So we're working directly with municipalities to expedite permitting and to prioritize our state financing and funding to move projects into construction, including both market rate and affordable housing. For example, we're now reviewing the MassWorks applications. These are infrastructure grants. And we're placing a very high priority for the first time on providing infrastructure funding to projects that include new multifamily development and mixed-use development. So I think you will see when the awards are announced soon that many housing projects will also get infrastructure support. Some of those will be funded by DHCD as well. So we're really trying to coordinate our funding sources. We're encouraging the creation of housing development incentive payment zones, as Barry had mentioned, and these are state tax credits for market rate housing in the gateway cities. We've approved plans for 7 cities, and we expect more zones to be approved in the future. We're now really looking at all the 40R districts and projects carefully, and other areas that are appropriately zoned for multifamily housing, and then really trying to market those districts to developers. At the same time, we're encouraging the creation of new 40R districts in compact neighborhoods and the new expedited 43D for housing, and offering planning grants to stimulate the activity. So we do have funding in the Smart Growth Trust Fund, as you know, so we really are encouraging the adoption of new districts. In June, during our first ever Massachusetts Housing Week, the governor announced new awards for approximately 700 units of permanent affordable housing. And then we're going to be announcing an additional 1,000 units of affordable housing in November next month as part of our current rental round, assuming that the housing bond bill passes. But Rep. Sanchez is going to help us get that done, hopefully next week. And we're making great progress on our supportive housing initiative. The governor created a goal of 1,000 units of supportive housing over the next 3 years. So far this year, we've awarded funds or created about 400 units of supportive housing for extremely low-income households. These include families, veterans, people with disabilities, and others who need both housing and support services, and coordinating those funding streams is a big part of what we're trying to do. We do have a new Housing Preservation and Stabilization Trust Fund, and once the money is deposited into that account, hopefully later this month, we'll be able to do 150 additional units of supportive housing with the $10 million that the legislature will provide. And finally, later this fall, we'll be announcing our first homeownership development round in many years to help moderate-income families to purchase their own homes. So you should look forward to that pre-application process later this fall. In terms of public housing, we're moving forward on a number of key reforms while also making significant new investments in revitalizing state public housing. Some of the more recent reforms include the development of a statewide waiting list and application process, mandatory commissioner trainings, mandatory financial audits for all housing authorities, and the developments for the first time of performance benchmarks and evaluations. So I think we're really trying to hold housing authorities accountable, but at the same time we know that they need more funding. And we've increased their public housing operating subsidy just this fiscal year by 9%, on top of what we did last year of 6%. And we were able to do this because of the investments we're making in energy efficiency, so we're getting utility savings in our public housing stock. And then we federalized close to 4,000 public housing units from state public housing to federal public housing. Now the federal government is going down to the low levels of the state public housing funding, but nevertheless, those federalized units have helped savings. This fall, in addition to our formula modernization grants, we're implementing several key public housing initiatives. I just wanted to go through a few of them. We're really focusing on getting vacant units that have been offline back online as quickly as possible, and we've reoccupied about 400 units over the past 2 years. And we'll be dedicating another $4 million to this effort this year. Later this month, we're going to be announcing our first awards to the housing authorities for comprehensive revitalization grants using mixed financing. In other words, leveraging our public investments with private financing, whether it's the 4% tax credit or others. And so I'm really excited about that. We'll be announcing those awards later this month to kick off that program. These are pre-development awards, and then they'll be followed up with more significant investments next year. This fall, we'll be issuing a NOFA for a new resident self-sufficiency program in state public housing and rental assistance, which will be a 5-year commitment to try and really work with families on job training, employment, child care, other supports that they need to be able to increase their incomes and create more sustainable tenancies. So we'll be investing in a resident self-sufficiency program this fall. All those grew out of our Public Housing Study Commission, and we're really acting on virtually every recommendation since the commission released its report last year in June. So in addition to multifamily production and the public housing initiatives I mentioned, I wanted to just finish up by letting you know of a few other things that are coming up. We are issuing 1,000 new state rental vouchers to help low-income families to afford rents in private apartments, and Barry mentioned the escalating rents, the lower vacancy rents, the rates, the tighter rental market. And so we have the MRVPs, which was provided by the legislature in the budget, and we're getting those out the door to 1,000 families now. Last fiscal year, we also issued 1,000 mobile vouchers. So this is the most number of new state vouchers issued in a 12-month period since the 1980s. So we are really spending every dime we have in helping low-income families afford their rent in private apartments through MRVP. But in addition to the mobile vouchers, I feel very strongly that we also have to provide project-based subsidies to spur development. So if we're going to ask developers to serve extremely low-income households, below 30% of area median income, you actually have to provide ongoing operating subsidy to do it, as well as the capital subsidy. So we issued 150 project-based vouchers in fiscal year 13, and we're going to be issuing 350 project-based vouchers as well this fiscal year with the legislative funding that we were provided with. 100 of those are in the current rental round. And so I'm hoping that we'll get those into placement as soon as possible, as soon as we announce the funding round and people can go forward with their projects. Finally, there's a new tax credit for community development corporations you may know about. I'm very excited about that program. And that's to leverage private support to support the operations and the capacity of our community development corporations. We've certified 41 across the state. They will be eligible for this new tax credit. And they're going to go out and raise funding and they're actually starting to do that. But we will have a NOFA on the street in November for this new community investment tax credit program for CDCs. And that is going to help in terms of undertaking revitalization projects, whether it's economic development or affordable housing going forward. So I'm looking forward to implementing that program as well. So I hope that gives you a sense of our work. We have a lot of challenges. I'm sure you know about and have heard about the huge increase in homelessness in Massachusetts among families. We're really working every day to try and reduce the numbers of families in the motels, but it's become very difficult over the summer. But we're deploying every resource we possibly can to make a dent into that problem. And then we have the federal government cutbacks that we're faced with. So I think there are a lot of great things going on. We need your help in advice and ideas, and keep those coming. And I know you're not shy, but we appreciate all the assistance you have helped us with. We have the best housing delivery system in the country. And we're utilizing all of our agencies. I know a lot of you feel very stretched to the limit, but we have to keep going forward. So thank you again for inviting me. And I don't know if you want to take questions or not. I'd be happy to, but it's more around the timing of the event. So I'll leave it up to Mary Jo.
It's a real pleasure to have Aaron here. It's an opportunity. So I think we have time for one or two questions to the Secretary. Right here.
More a question for Barry, but I'll be happy to answer. I'm not an economist, but certainly the foreclosure rates have gone down dramatically. I think the most recent months show a 40% decline, but in the spring we had a 70% decline compared to last year. So I think that's one important indicator of stabilization in the housing market, and obviously, increased values and home ownership prices. But that's weighed against the fact that there's an affordability problem that gets created as well. So you've got the good news of a stable market. There's also more investment in multifamily housing, clearly from the private sector. That's a good thing because we need more rental housing supply. So we look at that as an indicator as well, as how much is our supply going up? And as Barry has documented, that is happening. So there's very good signs in the housing market, but it also puts additional pressure, as you know, on low-income families, and that's the affordability issue that we've all been working on for so many years. So I don't know if that answers your question, but okay. Those are some of the indicators. There's many others, but okay.
Well, we'll have chance for more questions later. Any other questions for the Secretary? Right here.
Could you elaborate for 1 second on the Section 8 comment you made about that money drying up?
Yeah. So we cannot draw down on funds from HUD to pay the landlords as of November 1st on the Section 8 voucher program. We administer about 20,000 vouchers. The housing authorities administer another 55,000 vouchers. So I don't know I can't speak for the local housing authorities. Some have said, well, they'll be able to make the payment in November. I'm only going by what our staff is telling me and what we're hearing from HUD and what we're going to be telling Chris Norris and others, which is we will not be able to make November 1st payments unless the government reopens. So that's what I was referring to. But let me add one more thing about the Section 8 voucher program. Prior to the shutdown, we had the sequester, right? We have to make up $16 million in cuts to that program. And the Boston Housing Authority has also had to make up huge cut, as well as every other housing authority. So we're looking at all the options, but bottom line is 2 things are going to happen as of January 1st in our program. There's going to be a higher rent burden or utility burden for low-income families on the program. And number 2, those agencies that administer Section 8 will be suffering a 20% reduction roughly in the administrative fee. Our fee got reduced by 31%. So you're going to have a situation where the agency that have been administering Section 8 will not be able to do so in the way that we're used to them doing it. And that's going to lead to staff cutbacks and layoffs, and it could jeopardize the integrity of the program. So we are looking at ways to reduce the administrative burdens of the program at the same time that cuts are being made there. So the Section 8 program, in terms of the mobile vouchers, is facing very significant challenges. I don't want to end on bad news, so.
I think we're going to
Okay, we
have
will
to,
end on
for
bad
time,
news.
end it here. We do want to end on a bad note. If everybody would please join me in acknowledging our Secretary of the Aaron, we wish you the best of luck on these challenges going forward, and we're here to support you. So now we'd like to get to the meat of our discussion, and I'd like our panelists to please, our first set of panelists to please come to the stage, and then I will go ahead and introduce them. We have been favored over the last 10, 11 years in having a very consistent and strong group of people who have been here year after year to talk about and react to Barry's housing report card. We unfortunately do not have Chip Case with us today, and we wish Chip well, but we do have a newcomer with us who I think is going to add a lot to what we've got to talk about. So first of all, I'd like to introduce our panel. To my immediate right is Alicia Sasser Modestino, who's senior economist in the New England Public Policy Center at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. Prior to joining the bank, Alicia worked as an economist in the private sector and taught economics at Mount Holyoke College. Her current research focuses on labor force, migration, housing affordability, and expansions in health insurance coverage. Next to her is our good friend Tim Warren. Tim has always been an incredible contributor to the Commonwealth Housing Task Force. He provides much of the needed data that we need, and we always thank him for that. He is president and CEO of the Warren Group, a leader in New England real estate, financial news, and information. The Warren Group's publications and databases inform the discussions and decisions of regional and national policymakers. Tim has been, he joined that firm in 1973, is now the fourth generation of his family to lead the family-owned business. He's a graduate of Bowdoin College. Next to Tim is our newcomer, Eric Belsky. Eric is Managing Director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard University and a lecturer in urban planning and design at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. The center is a collaborative venture of both the Graduate School of Design and the JFK School of Government. Eric is a multi-degree individual, a bachelor's, master's, and PhD. Clearly, I don't have all that, from Clark University. And finally, to his right is our good friend Elyse Cherry, who's Chief Executive Officer of Boston Community Capital Community Development Financial Institution, whose mission is to build healthy communities where low-income people live and work through socially responsible lending and investing. Alicia's work has been funded for many years by the Boston Foundation. She's also president of Boston Community Venture Fund, which invests in businesses that have the potential to achieve a social return as well as a financial return. Elyse is a graduate of Wellesley College and the Northeastern University School of Law. So as you can tell, we've got a terrific group of people here with us today. And I'm just going to do a time check. We have about 25 minutes for this group to respond to Barry's report and findings, and then we're going to do a little bit of a pivot so that we can talk about some of the work that's been going on in these very important areas of affordable housing and production issues. So I think I'll just go down the row. They're set up this way for a reason, and start with Alicia, who is here from the FAD, and I'd like her to really give us that kind of, maybe it's not 60,000 feet view, but 30,000 feet, to talk about how you see what Barry's telling us, both from kind of a New England perspective, but also from the Federal Reserve's point of view.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I just want to thank Barry and his team for, again, putting together a wonderful report year in and year out. It's just served as a great resource to convene everyone around these issues in the greater Boston region. As he mentioned, the Massachusetts economy continues to expand at a modest pace along with the New England region, but has slowed recently, and unemployment has risen in Massachusetts in the last several months. The economic outlook calls for slow growth in 2014 that will pick up a little bit in 2015. But there are risks to this outlook that include some weakening in developing countries and markets, as well as fiscal headwinds from the sequestration, the government shutdown, and the possibility of the U.S. defaulting on its debt. Recovery in housing is healthy, but it continues to be slow. Although it does appear we have a true recovery on our hands, one that's based on the fundamentals, not tax incentives and those types of things. As Barry showed you, sales are up strongly since 2012. We've seen the share of distressed homes falling, as well as short sales have been falling as well. So these are healthy sales that we're seeing. Prices have been rising. Over the past year, prices have increased in much of New England, led by Massachusetts and Boston. The Massachusetts FHFA price index increased 5.5% over the past 12 months, and it's the strongest house price increase among the New England states. Greater Boston is leading the way with an increase of about 7% year over year. And this increase has been a little bit slower than the rest of the country, but as Barry mentioned, that's because prices did not fall as sharply here as they did in other places. So our recovery is not as much of a rebound as other places. Foreclosures continue to fall, which is great news. Foreclosures in Massachusetts are far below the US rate, and they're basically back to pre-crisis levels. They're still elevated in Rhode Island, Maine, and Connecticut, but they are continuing to trend down. And delinquency rates obviously are coming down as well. And with the increase in prices, we're also seeing fewer houses being underwater, which also helps the foreclosure situation, because if we do see more households suffering an income shock from a job loss, that means with higher prices, they are able to sell rather than go into foreclosure. The outlook, according to the New England Economic Partnership, is for housing in the Commonwealth to continue to recover. Growth may be slower in the coming months because we have seen a slowdown in the state economy, but they expect that things should pick up in 2015. And house prices are expected to grow on the order of 3 to 4% through their forecast period, which is the end of 2017, and that's when they project that prices might be back to their pre-recession levels. Sales are expected to be 30% higher in 2014 than they were in 2012, and permits are expected to reach their pre-recession levels in 2014 as well. There are some positive factors that are bolstering this outlook. One of them is obviously inventory is very lean right now. Excess inventory is now below trend for the first time since 2006, and inventory has fallen by 20% in both the nation as well as Boston. Builders are optimistic. Home builder sentiment index is continuing to rise, and it's basically back to the levels that we saw in 2002. And residential investment has now been adding to GDP since 2012, rather than dragging it down as it was during the housing crisis. And it's obviously been led by the investment in multifamily structures that we've seen. Consumer sentiment was up until recently. So as of August, the share of respondents who were looking to buy a home in the next 6 months or who expected prices to rise over the 12 months, that share had been rising. Consumer confidence had been increasing slightly in August, although it took a hit in September. Consumers are seeing that current conditions are good, but they're worried that this might not continue, mostly because of those fiscal headwinds that I talked about earlier. And of course, in the last week, we've seen quite a drop in consumer confidence, at least as measured by the Gallup Economic Confidence Index, which fell 12 points during the last week. This is the largest weekly decline since Lehman Brothers collapsed, and this is entirely driven by the government shutdown. Household formations were on the rise also until recently. So we've seen household formations trending up in 2012. There's been some softening in 2013. This was primarily driven by renter formations. So hopefully that's the 20-somethings moving back into the labor market and leaving their parents' houses. This could be potentially a big effect because the echo boom, or Generation Y, is even larger than the baby boom was at the ages of 20 to 24. And the question is whether or not or when this pent-up demand will be released, and a lot of that's going to depend on how fast the job market recovers and whether or not these individuals will be able to leave the nest. Now, there are some considerable headwinds that I mentioned to this forecast, and a lot of it stems from a combination of temporary factors as well as some that are a little more permanent. So the temporary factors are things that we hope are temporary, are the fiscal conditions related to the sequestration, the government shutdown, the possibility of defaulting on the debt. Moody's projects that the fiscal drag should peak at the end of 2013 and then abate in 2014 as long as the government reopens for business. Other pressures are here to stay, whether we like them or not, such as new mortgage regulations that are going to be coming into effect in January 2014, and eventually a return to higher interest rates. So on the temporary side, what we've seen with these fiscal impacts is a slowing of employment in Massachusetts. Among the New England states, Massachusetts had been performing extremely well. We had recovered all of the jobs that we lost during the recession, but as Barry mentioned, we've seen a slowdown in job growth since the early spring, and as a result, we've seen an increase in the unemployment rate relative to where we were last year. And this is, Massachusetts is the only state in New England that has seen an increase in the unemployment rate. Now, part of this is due to the fact that we did have strong job growth, and that did draw more people back into the labor force. So in Massachusetts, we have seen an increase in the number of workers who are seeking work. Unfortunately, that happened at the same time that we got a slowdown in job growth, and so our unemployment rate increased. The projected impacts of the sequestration put out by the Obama administration show that Massachusetts was expected to lose about 7,000 jobs related to the sequestration. The outlook for the New England Economic Partnership is for employment to grow about 1% over the course of 2013 and then pick up in 2014, and over the 5-year forecast period to grow on an order of about 1.5% per year, but that will be below what we expect for the nation. On the more permanent side, what we've seen in terms of lending standards are that They have continued to be tight, although fewer banks are tightening standards. Banks actually made more mortgages last year than in any year since the housing downturn struck in 2007. Obviously, this had a lot to do with low mortgage rates. A recent paper by Neil Buda and Glenn Canner at the Federal Reserve Board analyzed HMDA data over the last few years and found a few interesting things. First of all, lending is up, but there's kind of a big asterisk next to this, and that is because a lot of the lending actually was for refinancing, which is a good thing, but maybe doesn't suggest as much lending for homeownership as we thought was going on. So loans made to people actually buying homes increased by only 13%, to levels that were still below what we had seen during the boom. Borrowers also are having more trouble making down payments, so a lot of the lending that we've seen for new homes has actually been carried by the FHA and the VA, which have the lowest down payment requirements among all lenders. That accounted for almost 45% of new purchase loans. And also there's large racial and ethnic gaps that still persist. So in terms of the number of loans that were made for home purchases, Asian and white borrowers accounted for about 15% of that increase, but lending among African American and Hispanics was only about half that. And finally, loan quality has pretty much been pristine up to this point, although we have seen a little bit in terms of relaxing of standards in terms of credit scores. Now, one question that I guess has been circulating is how much will the new mortgage regulations be affecting the housing market recovery? Some have suggested that this is going to stall the recovery, or it even has already began to stall the recovery before the regulations have taken effect. These are regulations that were put in place under the Dodd-Frank Act, and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau recently issued proposed regulations in August that had to do with percentage of down payment and debt-to-income ratios. It was expected that perhaps a 20% down payment would be required. They put in another alternative that did not require a 20% down payment, but did require a 43% debt-to-income ratio. Now, some have suggested that this is a very stringent requirement, but that same Federal Reserve study that I mentioned earlier finds that only about 20% of new mortgages would actually be restricted under that guideline. And of those 20%, about 70% are already federally guaranteed. So they don't anticipate that this is going to be a huge effect on lending. However, once you do put some regulations in place that restrict lending, you will see lenders responding to them. But I would say that there was a reason that we put these regulations in place that we just lived through. And so to some extent, I think this is the job that regulators fulfill. So we do expect to see some curtailment in lending related to that, but hopefully at an appropriate level.
Okay, thank you. Let's go down a little bit lower in terms of our kind of regional look at things and ask Tim to tell us. Tim, you're looking at this stuff every month. You're giving us, we read about your monthly data in the Globe and other publications, certain in Banker and Tradesman. And is there anything in Barry's report that surprises you, or what's your take on what you're seeing here?
Well, let me say at the outset that I thank you for inviting me once again, and we're happy to provide Barry with data to use for his excellent study and report. I also like to remind everyone that I'm the person up here with 1 degree and not multiple degrees. I'm the data guy, and I'm not really a policy wonk. I'm not an economist, and I don't get to do research projects, but I am mired in the data. And one of the aspects of Barry's report that I wanted to make a few observations about is the current market conditions. I'm sure that everybody has talked to or read about people going out home shopping and running into open houses with lots and lots of people attending them and being asked to submit a bid by Tuesday at 8 a.m. In order to do that, and then finding that their bid is one of 6, and homes going for over the asking price. So there's sort of a feeding frenzy there, and I wanted to address Barry's question as to whether there might be a coming bubble in pricing. And to do that, I would like to give some historical perspective about the crash that we are just emerging from. I say that we're in the second year of recovery. Compare it with the crash that we saw in the early 1990s. And the interesting thing is that this last crash was much, much worse than what we saw in the 1990s. And a lot of us experienced the 1990s and never thought we'd see anything as bad again, but this was worse. And here are some of the reasons why I say that. In the 1990s, the decline lasted half as long. Here, this current one lasted about 6 years. It was 3 years back in the 1990s. The median price really fell twice as much this time as it did last time, roughly 12% in the 1990s and about 20% in the one that we're just emerging from. And the recovery last time was really a 6-year recovery, a very slow, steady growth. And I think, I might challenge Barry a little bit, but I think we may get to the previous highs next year that we saw, the highs in median prices that we saw back in 2005 or 2006. And so it's a much more rapid increase in prices now. In the second year of the recovery in the 1990s, prices went up 1%. This year, second year of the recovery, prices are up about 12% so far this year. So double-digit increase. I don't think it's going to take 6 years in this recovery. So I've been giving some thought as to why prices are rising rapidly this time. And my conclusion is really pent-up demand and low inventory. And those are, even though I'm not an economist, I know enough that supply and demand drives a lot of these things. And so I had a look at what the number of single-family homes that were sold in the 10 years prior to this crash. And there were roughly 60,000 per year for 10 years running. During the crash, there were about 40,000, for 5 years running, about 40,000 single-family homes sold. This is in all of Massachusetts. So that's a deficit of 20,000 homes that didn't sell each year for 5 years. That's 100,000 homes that didn't happen. Now, I would say that people still got married, they still had kids, they still kicked their kids out of the house, they still changed their jobs, they moved, they relocated, but they were afraid to move. And they didn't want to move. They were worried about their 401ks. They were worried about a whole bunch of things, including all of the press reports of disaster and everything else. So I think that created a lot of pent-up demand. A lot of people who normally would have relocated, done something about their home, didn't do it. Maybe 100,000 people didn't do it. And so now you have those 100,000 people out there looking at the housing market, and for reasons that still escape me, they just aren't finding very many homes for sale. People aren't willing to sell their houses, perhaps until prices get back to their previous peak. And so the low inventory of opportunity is creating upward pressure on the pricing. So those are just some observations of what's different this time compared with the last recovery.
Thank you, Tim. Now I'd like to turn to Eric Belsky, who's our rookie on our panel, although not a rookie on this topic. And Eric, you were a key part of the Housing Advisory Panel for Mayor Menino's Housing Boston 2020 project. Give us your insight from the kind of City of Boston level, and how realistic is the goal of building 30,000 units?
So let me say a couple of things. Obviously, first, also want to applaud Barry for a terrific report. This is something I think we all look forward to now, year after year, and it's kind of like a rite of the fall to get that report and to focus on these issues in such an intelligent way, I think, in such a comprehensive way. It's remarkable. I also want to comment for a moment on what you were saying about, why are markets where we are, and I think it's basically tight markets. When you walk up the path and there's 3 other people walking up the path with you to a home you're going to be looking to buy, you start thinking, well, I may have to offer above the asking price. So it's simple as tight markets. So the real question is, how long will the supply of homes for sale on the market remain so low? And that's really difficult to judge, because as prices go up, an economist would say you're going to hit a reservation price in the mind of a seller who's willing then to put their homes on the market. And in fact, real estate agents, as you know, are going out and talking to people and say, would you consider selling your home at this price? And many people are saying yes, and that's kind of how desperate we are to try to get houses on the market and supply on the market. And the numbers of supply that we're even looking at now, I think, are really a lot of homes that have actually been on the market for a very long time and are mispriced. And as soon as a house comes on the market, people descend on it that is reasonably priced. They sell really quickly. So I agree that there's a strong potential, if the spring buying season turns out to be strong, that we'll see very significant increases in the spring. A lot of this depends on what happens with the federal government. In terms of what's happening in Boston, I think Barry got it exactly right. It's been a long-standing problem for the greater Boston area, just simply the amount of units you can produce and how many you can produce that are economizing on the value of land, because the value of land is so high because people want to live closer and closer into what's an incredibly dynamic city that's just been, in a sense, on the affordability side, the victim of its own success and becoming such a terrific place to live. And so obviously the mayor looks at this, he's looked at this in this way for many years, that this is largely a supply question. And so the question is, how do you get the supply? And it's not just getting the supply, but importantly, if you want to deal with some of the affordability issues that I know Elyse works so tirelessly on, you have to focus on trying to target that in some way to try to produce in a dedicated way homes for middle-income people. And of course, middle-income people are really feeling the squeeze. Barry's numbers show it. They're actually on the decline, and that's a significant problem for a city that wants to be inclusive. So the mayor not only talked about 30,000 units, which frankly was the city's best estimate of how many units you would need just to keep up with the job growth we expect to see in the greater Boston region, and the proportion of people who typically of that job growth look to live in the city and will be looking to live in the city. And if you don't have that, you're going to creating even more pressure on a limited supply. So that's just to keep up. So, can we do it? We kind of have to if we don't want it to get even more and more tight in terms of supply. And as I said, an effort to try in at least a limited way to try to reach out to middle income buyers by providing some down payment assistance, but to really focus city-owned land and other things on trying to deliver affordable housing, allowing greater density on that land, concessions in terms of the pricing of it, to try to just, target as much as possible. The headline number that everybody focused on was the 30,000. I would say, this is typical of the mayor. He's going pedal to the metal. He's got, saying he's going to try to get, 3,500 permits out between now and the end of the year. And, I think, he's going to go out and turn out the lights with them, and they're certainly trying to do that. This is, of course, within the city of Boston, saying, well, oh my God, all these housing units are suddenly going to pop up in my neighborhood. So you start getting calls about that. But that's kind of what needs to happen. And if it's done and designed intelligently, which is a large part of what the mayor would like to see, and we certainly have the talent in the architectural pool in this city to do it, you can do this and still create workable places. A lot of questions around parking requirements. So there's just a lot of efforts to do something to push. But as I said, the headline number is at 30,000, but it also talks about the need to preserve 52,000 units, which is a larger number of already subsidized units in the Boston area, and I think that's critical. And then an effort to really figure out, can we streamline processes? Can we come up with designs that work for the general public? So there were also efforts to introduce studies and other things to try to push that. In the end, of course, there'll be a lot that happens in a flurry of activity in the next. Now it's only, 3 months. When it came out, it was 3.5 months, and that 2 weeks mattered for the ambition of the plan. But it really is a sort of, here's what a group of people, and it was developers, it was lenders, it was a lot of community development corporations, people brought into working groups to broaden that, including labor. What do we need to do? What's a roadmap? Keep this on the agenda and give some ideas to the next administration that comes in and says, look, if you want to achieve something in Boston, it's not just going to happen by accident. It's going to have to be a very deliberate push. And we are blessed with a state and a city that really cares about housing in a way that I don't see anywhere else in the country, frankly, and I think has an array of programs to try to address these, but the need is enormous, the challenges are great. The Boston Foundation has been focused on these issues for a long time, so it's just, you got to keep that focus up and you got to keep the pressure on, otherwise it's going to become a really very, very grievously unaffordable place, and it already is for so many.
So what a perfect segue to Elyse Cherry. So You are our representative on the panel who is actively involved on the ground on these issues. Is it one step forward, two steps back, or is it 30,000 units, yeah, we'll do it?
First, let me offer my thanks as well to the Boston Foundation for decades now of consistent support. Every time we dream up a new initiative, they're right there with us as a wonderful partner to help move it forward. And I also want to thank Barry and his colleagues at the Dukakis Center and my colleagues on the panel. For me, in this role as a practitioner, this is really a moment each year to take a step back and sort of think about whether what we're seeing on the ground really matches what we see in the charts and the information and so forth. And it's interesting, you know, in prior years I've talked about this as a lumpy housing market in the sense that values were going up in middle and upper middle income communities, but not necessarily going up in low income, particularly urban communities. You know, I'm a little further along at this point. From our perspective, it's a bit of a schizophrenic housing market. You know, part of the challenge here is when you look at the low-income communities that Boston Community Capital attempts to serve, the percentage of income that people are paying for housing is very, very high. It's actually, I think, much higher than it is out in the middle income and upper income communities. And income, of course, is flat. And so when I think about what it is that needs to support a rise in housing prices over time, there are really two factors to that, right? One is subsidy, and while the state has done yeoman service in terms of its resources, the federal government is an enormously powerful player here. And at a minimum, one needs a functioning federal government in order to actually satisfy
An open one.
an open federal government would be a starting place, right? And the second thing, of course, that's needed is sufficient tax receipts and a willingness, not just on the part of President Obama, but on the part of the Congress to actually support affordable housing. So I look at that and I worry about it, and then I look at income and I worry about it because income has been flat now for a very long time. One could think 1997, perhaps before that. And so when I think about what the trajectory for housing prices is in lower income communities, it's very hard to figure out how that price goes up absent either increase in income or increase in subsidy. Now, a few years ago, what happened, of course, is that we were allowing to no-doc loans. The good work, I think, of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has now really put a stop to a lot of that, so we're actually underwriting. But what that means is a whole lot of folks can't afford to buy a home. So I do worry some. I support the regulatory work that the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has been doing. But what I worry about is that the constriction in lending will be really focused on lower income communities. One thing I will tell you is that community development financial institutions, of which Boston Community Capital is one, are actually exempt from the CFPB regulations. And that makes me think a whole lot about whether there is a bigger role for community development financial institutions to play with respect to financing not just people in default or foreclosure in low-income communities, which we've been doing steadily, but also people with good credit in low-income communities. And that's something that we're beginning to think about. We do see on the ground a lot of what Tim and others have been talking about with respect to the drop in foreclosures. The demand that we see in Massachusetts now is really much diminished from Boston and its surrounding communities. We're still seeing a lot of demand from places like Worcester County and actually farther west out in Springfield. But what's really interesting about this is we've just now opened in Maryland, and that's prelude to opening in another half dozen states, I hope in the next 6 months. And we have been absolutely swamped with calls from Maryland where the differential between the bubble price and the current price is still very significant, and there's still a ton of people in default and foreclosure. So I think what that says is that Massachusetts has moved out ahead of the curve. I think that the support from the state has been very important. I think that the comeback in both jobs and in housing prices has helped to stabilize neighborhoods. And so in general, we are doing better. The concern, of course, is whether that will continue. And then I guess, because I know we're short of time here, but the final point that I really want to make is we are also seeing a larger than anticipated number of homes in which the condition of the home is so poor that when we send folks out to appraise or to assess, they come back and say, really the thing needs to be rebuilt. And our advice to the defaulting or foreclosed homeowner is, there's no point buying this home back because it costs too much in order to renovate it. And I think as near as we can tell, that challenge is greater today because of the period of foreclosure and default that we've come through. As housing prices dropped, as more homeowners turned into underwater homeowners, as less work occurred on the home because of either a period of default or a period of foreclosure, the condition of aging housing stock has really plummeted. And so when I think about the way in which we're going to satisfy the increasing need for housing over time, new units is certainly a key piece of that, but maintaining the integrity of an existing stock is also really important. And where the money for that comes from is also not clear to me. So, and again, from our perspective, whether it's talking about people in default or people in foreclosure or the condition of individual homes, the real issue here is not just the individual family, although we're very focused on that. The real issue is stability of our lower income neighborhoods and our urban areas, and that really is, as Barry I think made the point very strongly with respect to housing values, contributes a lot to the stability of Boston and the other urban areas, and that contributes to the stability of the suburbs. So somewhere in all of this, I think we need to focus on ways to actually restore not just the housing that was originally financed through federal tax credit programs, which is also a very significant issue, but housing that's simply owned by regular old lower and lower middle income families who do not necessarily have the means to rehab what is now a very extensive need in these particular homes. So.
Thank you all for that very cogent set of perspectives. We're going to have time for just 2 questions because we do have some other information I think you're going to be very interested in, and I want to get that in as well. So who's got a question for, and if we could have a question, it'd be great. Way in the back, is that Dave?
Hi, Mary Jo. Dave Luca from the Mass Association of Realtors. I guess the question has to do with CFPB and the 20% down rule. I think that the regulators and legislators are not in the same world, because I know certainly that Congressman Frank and Senator Warren both didn't intend for that to happen. And we've been lobbying against it, obviously, as an association. What is I've seen no statistics from the Federal Reserve or other agencies on the failure rate of a 20% down loan versus a 3% FHA loan and a VA loan with nothing down. And we know anecdotally that those have very low failure rates. The issue is not down payment. The issue is quality of the appraisal and the qualifications of the homeowner. And they're not focusing enough on those things. And do you see anything going in that direction?
So I think, your description of the situation is accurate. They came out with a proposal for a 20% down payment for the qualified residential mortgage definition. We've already turned that corner on the qualified mortgage. That's not going to happen for qualified mortgage, but it's still out there, and that would be very serious because it would mean that banks, have to hold 4% capital against anything that has more than 80%, and they have to actually hold it. They can't sell it into a secondary market. That would be, a significant hit to the supply of credit. Part of the challenge in looking at these loan-to-value ratios, to your point, is that some of the values and the appraised values weren't necessarily reasonable reflections of the value at the time that they were, so they can exaggerate the problem. But one study I would suggest you look at was done by the University of North Carolina's Center for Community Capital, in which they look at how many performing loans would be knocked out, and performing loans through the worst housing performance and the worst housing markets we've seen since the Depression, and not too far off from what they were like then. And you can see that, if you went to a 10% down payment, for example, you'd knock out like, 9 performing loans for every 1 non-performing loan that you were trying to save. And that would just be an enormous constriction of credit. The down payment is the single most important variable because people just don't have the wealth to put down, especially first-time buyers who feed the market, who are important to the stability in general of markets and also to their own economic progress. And so that's really critical. And I think there's a lot of evidence that shows that, yes, it makes a difference what your loan-to-value ratio is, but it really only makes a difference when prices are going down. And then when they're going down, it doesn't make as big a difference as some may believe.
All right. One other question from our audience. Is there someone else who hasn't asked a question yet? I just want to make sure we have ability to pass this around. How about right here?
Hi, Sarah Barkin from CDAC. We've noticed a somewhat disturbing trend, particularly in Boston projects in the last 4 to 6 months, which is a real spike in construction bids, leaving projects with really significant potential gaps. And combined with an increase in interest rates, which lessens their ability to leverage. So we're concerned about our continued ability to finance these projects at the state level, because they will require such a sort of deeper hit of resources to move forward. I'm just wondering, from our economist's perspective, what you're seeing in the construction industry. What do you think is driving this, and if you expect this to continue?
Alicia?
That's an excellent question. It's definitely true that building costs are much higher here, and they have spiked recently. In general, they've always been high in the greater Boston area. I think part of what drives that is what Barry alluded to in terms of regulations. I mean, this most recent spike, I mean, obviously has to do with other factors as well, but I think one of the things longer term is making sure that we do address some of those zoning issues, because they do get capitalized into the prices and the pricing of construction projects. So one of the things that you're talking about is the ability, right, of the developer to be able to hold on to this land and develop it while this is going on. And I think that in terms of how quickly we can streamline the process for developers, that can help eliminating some of the restrictions that Mayor Menino was talking about in terms of parking and other things can help. But really, like longer term, in terms of thinking about the zoning restrictions that we face and how can we make sure that those don't inhibit those types of projects from getting done. Because, I mean, in general, it's an expensive place to build. The cost of land itself is really expensive, but making sure that we don't add to that cost, I think, is really important going forward.
Going back to where we are in terms of the government, I'll just say very quickly, FHA multifamily insurance lenders are allowed to continue to allow for construction draws in this environment, but the lender's taking the risk that they'll then come back in and nullify something that happened. So there's an immediate issue right now that relates to the government shutdown, and the long-term issues are dramatic. In Boston, the cost of developing a unit went from $300,000, which was already high in 2000, to $500,000+ over the last couple of years. So it is a huge challenge when you're carrying those kind of land costs through a construction period, and then you throw in monkey wrenches around government insurance. It's really tough.
Right. All right, would you please join me in thanking this incredibly great panel? And then I would like each one of our next set of panelists to just come up one by one and give us a very brief update on the work that you're doing with the Commonwealth Housing Task Force. Before I do that, I want to acknowledge Jerry Rappaport, who has joined us, who is also a co-chair of the Commonwealth Housing Task Force. And I was going to acknowledge Robert Beal of Beal Companies, who was an incredible force in putting the task force together. First of all, I'd like to ask Eleanor White to come up. We are blessed to have Eleanor White back in the United States after a stint in Norway, where she and her husband Barry White served as the ambassador and the ambassador's wife. And after that, I'm going to ask Sarah Lamity to join us, Chuck Eisenberg, and Ted Carmen. So if you'd give us 2.5 minutes, one by one, I'd really appreciate it.
Okay, thanks, Mary Jo, and hi, everybody. It's good to be back. I will also add to the chorus of thanks to the Boston Foundation for their support of the Commonwealth Housing Task Force all these years. I have to say it's wonderful to be back in a place where people understand what affordable housing is, because trying to explain that in Norway, which I describe as an oil sheikdom in the Arctic, is almost impossible, but that's a story for another day. The Commonwealth Housing Task Force has continued to be very active. We have a great set of committees, and you're going to hear from two of them today. But this is a great time for me personally to come back just as we're entering a big recovery after a long decline. So I couldn't be happier to be back. Let me not take any more time from our speakers, who all have really interesting things to tell us. Sarah Lamity, who is Vice President and Community Investment Officer at Boston Private Bank, has served as co-chair with Jackie Cooper of the Expanding Opportunities Committee. This committee, you may remember, was inaugurated to first encourage more people of color to join the task force itself, and second, to look into issues of inequality, to look into issues of making our product available to people of color, to people of low income, to people with disabilities. And it's doing a wonderful job and has a terrific initiative that Sarah's going to tell you about.
Thanks so much, Eleanor. Before talking about our exciting project, I just want to acknowledge how happy I am to have you back in the country. It was just remarkable how you were able to hold down 2 full-time jobs, one of your service in Norway, and 2, your ongoing commitment to affordable and market rate housing issues in Massachusetts that you are so passionate about. You were incredibly accessible during the 3 years you were away. I was constantly marveling for steadfastly at your responsiveness. And I'm just thrilled to have you back, where we can get even more benefit from your expertise and your energy and your commitment. So it's nice to see you. So Eleanor described the committee's efforts. I just want to acknowledge that Jackie Cooper from Financial Education Resources is also here today. Jackie, do you want to just say a quick hello and raise your hand? So our update is on an ongoing project that we're working on, which is a student competition. The competition is to promote ideas and generate innovative ideas that will help promote the work of the committee. With Eleanor's tremendous efforts while she was away, we've developed a very impressive academic advisory committee that advised us on the competition and that is promoting the competition among their students right now as we speak. We distributed the notice of the competition last month. The idea is to generate ideas that will inform the work of the committee as we go forward in the coming months and years. Unlike some other competitions that you may know about, we're really focused on the ideas itself. So if a student is working in a class or in a community and has an idea about how a good way to promote housing access or a good way to promote making a community more welcoming to diverse populations, we are interested in having them submit a proposal whether or not they're able to actually participate in the implementation of it. So I want to just emphasize that it's not necessarily a full-blown project that we're looking for. It's really to generate ideas for work going forward. So the ideas for the projects or programs or research might be focused on one community. They might be broader based. All are welcome. And we're particularly interested in programs, projects, or research that would be done in partnership with a private developer or a local nonprofit or a public agency. So just to give you, that's just to give you a quick picture. The notice of the competition is available on the Commonwealth Housing Task Force website. I encourage you all to go there. The deadline for submissions is November 1st. I wanted to encourage you all to take a look. It is not too late to promote this among academics or students you may know. Because of the focus on ideas, I think there's really adequate time to be able to put together a really credible proposal. So I just wanted to keep it brief. If you would like to know any more about the committee's work or the competition, please feel free to touch base with either Jackie or myself afterward. Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks for that nice welcome back. Next, we're going to hear from Chuck Eisenberg, who is the chair of the Public Housing Committee of the Commonwealth Housing Task Force. This committee has been doing yeoman's work in terms of generating consensus proposals to get us through the thicket of warring proposals on what to do about public housing and local housing authorities in Massachusetts. And what I've been particularly happy to see is participation by local housing authorities and members of Mass Narrow in this conversation. So Chuck.
Thank you. Since I work with Eleanor, we are real happy to have her back. I had a bunch of cute, pithy statements that I was going to make, but I thought better of it. I know. You may have seen that in the papers recently that there's a certain amount of controversy about public housing authorities in Massachusetts, and we've been in the middle of it. And we came out with a report. We have 40 people on the committee, and they range across the board from tenants to housing authority directors to Mass Narrow to people from the executive branch. We've been trying to reach a consensus. You heard a bunch of things that Aaron listed that are initiatives that the state is taking. Actually, every single one of those are recommendations that came from this committee. Now, I'm not saying that because we recommended them that the state accepted them, but that's probably the first place that they came out. We submitted a 200-page report to the Governor's Commission with recommendations. We're continuing to work with all sides to try and get this resolved in some way, because doing nothing would be the worst thing. Just recently, a week or two ago, we testified at the public hearing that the Joint Committee on Housing held with a set of recommendations. And I think, and fingers crossed, I think things are coming back to kind of where we were a year or two ago, and there may be some resolution. The other things we're doing are, we've been working, we're part of the group that's been working with the state to set up a mixed finance program. I think you heard Aaron talk about that. They're rolling out the first part of it. We were very involved in that. We're also involved in trying to push the Public Housing Innovations Bill, which would allow a demonstration program for authorities that would give them the flexibility to operate more efficiently and effectively. And that's been hung up because of some issues involving tenants. And we negotiated between the Senate and the Mass Union of Tenants, and we think we're now at a place where that bill's going to come out of committee and get passed as well. The one other thing that I've been doing is Aaron alluded to the housing bond bill. We've testified 4 times now in the past 6 months at various Senate and House committee meetings in support of the housing bond bill, and in particular 2 sections. One is a section which provides, changes the rules on the distribution of capital funds in smart growth districts so that you can have more mixed-use projects getting the TOD, transit-oriented development funds. And the other thing is the increase in capital funds that are going to be made available for public housing renovation. So we've been busy, and the general goal is to try and bring people together and reach a consensus and actually accomplish something. Maybe we'll try Washington.
Thanks, Chuck, and thanks for heading up this effort. It's been really important, I think, in developing a consensus. I'm going to introduce the next speaker in 1 second, but I want to take this opportunity to tell you to please encourage colleagues to join the Commonwealth Housing Task Force. As you know, it's free, it's somewhat virtual, and it does give us a great forum to get ideas, feedback, and generate not only consensus, but also generate, what's a nice word for pressure, advocacy at various levels. Finally, our final speaker is, before Mary Jo closes this, our final speaker is Ted Carman. I want to make sure everybody realizes that 40R was really Ted's idea to begin with. He is the father of 40R. Many of us have sort of jumped on the bandwagon, but he's the one who started it all. And many people have said, well, what's up with 40R? We don't see anything happening. You are going to literally see what's been happening. Ted?
Thank you, Eleanor, and it is wonderful to have you back. And I'm happy to be here to make a report on the progress of 40R. Both Aaron and Eric said that Massachusetts has probably the best housing delivery system in the country. And I think the fact that we have shown that Barry's slides show the extraordinary amount of new construction in multifamily that's going on just in the last year or two is a function of this 10 years of effort of trying to coordinate all of the activities that need to take place. Chapter 40R has had 32 districts passed across the state. 12,350 units are now zoned as of right. I'm going to show you pictures of about 2,000 of them, or 1,500 of them. 40R, not all of them. Not that many pictures, right. One of the things to keep in mind is that zoning is very emotional and is very difficult to get done. It takes years. Getting a project financed takes years. So what you're going to see is the result of all of this work. And Chapter 40R offers a collaborative way to plan for the future, both for communities and for developers. There are incentives that are provided for communities, financial incentives. There are design standards to assure quality for the neighbors. It offers a real opportunity to use the best concepts of new urbanism and traditional neighborhood development. And it offers assurance that school costs won't be a burden on the community for the projects. It's been very effective in moving these ideas along. I'd also like to say that DHCD has done an excellent job in administering the program. It's been done much, much better here than in Connecticut, which tried to do the same thing. DHCD offered last spring a set of amendments to the regulations or adjustments. We felt that they were almost entirely big positives. They solved some technical issues. There was a hearing in August. There was, I think, a consensus at the hearing that the regulations were going in the right directions, and I believe that they're going to have new regs shortly. So let me start here with a project that one of the earlier ones done in Belmont. This project involved 6 months of negotiations with the neighbors to make sure that the Catholic church that was being sold and the land that was being freed up would fit into the neighborhood. And you can see how well that was accomplished. On the other side of the picture, in Haverhill, the community passed a large district downtown that allowed big projects to take place. This is the Hamel Mill Lofts, 305 units. The developer, Greg Arsham, was here last spring and said they would not have done this project without 40R. 2 other projects have been built in Haverhill under the program, and there are several others in the works. This project is in Reading, 176 units. It's finished. It's at the corner of Route 28 and 128. And if you go up Route 128 a mile or so, this project, 30 Haven Street, has been finished. It's right at, as a matter of fact, Chuck was involved in this project, and Eleanor. 53 apartments. It's mixed use. It's right at the train station. It's a wonderful example of new urbanism. At the other end of the state, we have the Rice Silk Mill, 45 units in Pittsfield. The developer here also said publicly he would not have done the project without Chapter 40R. A little further away in Pittsfield had 5 or 6 different areas zoned for 40R. 2 of them have been built on already. This is New Amsterdam, 55 units. It's a block from one of the first projects I ever built with Eleanor's help many, many years ago in Pittsfield called Bradford Arms with the HUD 236 program. This was the first project done under 40R, 15 units, another Catholic church in Norwood, Mass. Norwood has 2 other zones that either have been approved or about to be approved with projects that will be coming online in the next couple of years. In Northampton, the old state hospital there was rezoned with Chapter 40R. Wonderful example of new urbanism in all these different types of buildings being produced. This is 62 units, but it's going to end up being more like 400 or 500 units before it's all finished. In North Reading, again, one of the early projects, 406 apartments, Edgewood Apartments. In Linfield, a very complicated 40R that not only included these 180 apartments, but included under 40R, a 450,000 square foot open marketplace being developed by National Development, which has been built. So 40R accomplished not just getting 180 housing units built, but also almost 500,000 square feet of modern marketplace retail. This is in Lunenburg, further west, 99 apartments. Phase 2 is about to start. In Lawrence, the Wind Company developed Arlington Mills, 75 units. There are several other 40R districts in Lawrence that are in the works. This is in Lakeville, right at the train station in Lakeville, 104 units. Riverside Commons in Fitchburg, under construction. Actually, this picture is under construction. It's now finished. They're renting up. It has a second phase. And in Fitchburg, there is zoning in place for another 600 or 700 units, 4 or 5 other mill buildings right near this area, which is just west of the downtown. This is an example of how flexible the program is. It's a 2-unit project done in Brockton. Again, Brockton is a place where 40R was used to zone a half a dozen areas in the downtown. They were not all contiguous, but they allowed almost 1,000 units in various projects. So this is number 1. This project being done by Jason Korb, Station Lofts, is almost finished. It was under construction when this was taken. There's another project there being done by Trinity Financial that I think is going to have 200 or 300 housing units. It's almost financed. It's right at the train station. This is one that Jerry was very involved in, Olmsted Green in Boston near Forest Hills. A truly wonderful example of new urbanism that was built and is now up and running. And finally, in Chelsea, this is a 120-unit project, but look at the diversity of the design that was accomplished here. It really shows the flexibility and the fact that you don't have to fit everything into one box. So in wrapping up, 40R offers an opportunity to really integrate the projects into the community. It gives, with the design standards, an opportunity for people to really have input on what gets built. So it brings together a confluence of self-interest between the developers, the neighbors, the community, which gets the incentive payments, and the ability to really plan for the future. Finally, there can be real assurance about school costs, because if the cost of educating the children in any of these districts exceeds 50% of the property taxes, the state will pay the difference. And the state is now doing that in 2 or 3 of these projects, which makes a huge impact in terms of acceptability. And finally, let me say that I think Barry's reports for the last 4 or 5 years have talked about how the need for housing going forward is for empty nesters, young professionals, inner cities, and 40R is clearly a mechanism and a tool that makes that work very well. Thank you.
Well, I think that's a perfect way to end our time together this morning. 40R got started about 10 years ago. finally, we're seeing some incredible examples of it coming to fruition. I want to congratulate you, Ted, and everybody else that was involved in the formation of that. And let's get this message out. This is the way to keep this going, because this is a tool that Barry has told us works now in these kinds of conditions. So thanks again to everyone. Thank you for coming, and we'll see you again in a year at this.